In the dead of a frontier winter, when temperatures dropped below zero and firewood meant the difference between life and death, one man built a cabin that everyone said would kill his family. It wasn't bigger, it wasn't better insulated, and it didn't burn more wood. In fact, it burned less. While every other cabin in the valley froze overnight, fires dying, floors turning to ice, families waking shivering before dawn, his stayed nearly 30 degrees warmer by morning, with no extra fuel, no electricity, no modern insulation, no tricks, just stone, just shape, and a decision to ignore everything experts said you had to do to survive winter. They laughed at him, they warned him, they called it dangerous. But when the cold finally tested every home the same way, winter made the judgment for them. This is the story of how one round stone cabin quietly outperformed every square one around it, and why the people who mocked it were forced to copy it just to stay alive. If you've ever wondered whether the old way was really the best way, this story has an answer. Winter had a way of humbling people in those days. Not dramatically, not all at once. It didn't arrive with speeches or warnings. It came quietly, night after night, stealing heat a little faster than fires could replace it. By the time most families realized they were losing, winter had already settled in and made itself at home. In places where temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there, cold wasn't an emergency. It was a condition, something you planned around, complained about, and eventually surrendered to. You split more wood, you burned it faster. You woke up before dawn to restart fires that never seemed to last the night, and you told yourself the same thing everyone else did. That's just how winter is. Most cabins were built the same way. Rectangular, straight walls, sharp corners, a stone fireplace on one end, logs stacked tight and chinked with mud and moss. It was the design people trusted because it was the design they knew. Fathers had lived in them. Grandfathers too. If a cabin was cold, that wasn't a failure of the building. That was winter doing what winter always did. But the cold didn't behave evenly. Corners stayed frozen no matter how hot the fire burned. Floors turned to ice by morning. Wind found its way through seams you swore were sealed. Heat rose straight up the chimney while your feet stayed numb and your breath hung in the air. You weren't heating the cabin so much as fighting it, feeding firewood into a structure that leaked warmth faster than it could hold it. By morning, water buckets skimmed over with ice. Coals lay dead in the hearth. And the day began the same way every winter day began, chopping wood before you could feel your hands. Wood was life, and it vanished quickly. Families measured winters not in snowfall, but in cords burned. 4 cords meant you barely made it. 6 meant you were lucky. 10 meant you still felt cold, just less desperate about it. Everyone assumed this was the cost of survival. No one questioned the building itself. They questioned only whether they had stacked enough logs before the snow came. No one talked about shape. No one talked about how heat moved once it left the fire. And no one talked about why 2 cabins sitting side by side, burning the same amount of wood, could feel wildly different by morning. Cold nights were the real enemy. You could survive a bitter day by staying close to the fire. Night was different. Night demanded stored warmth, and most cabins had none. When the flames died, the heat left with them. Logs insulated, but they didn't remember warmth. Stone fireplaces radiated heat straight out, not back into the room. Air warmed briefly, then escaped. People didn't call it inefficient. They called it normal. Children learned early where to sit to avoid drafts. Women layered bedding until movement was impossible. Men slept light, listening for the sound of a fire fading, ready to wake and feed it before the cold crept too far in. Winter trained people to accept exhaustion as routine, but there was always someone who noticed patterns others ignored, someone who paid attention not to tradition, but to results. He noticed that fires burned hardest near the walls, not the center, that corners stayed cold no matter how high the flames climbed, that wood vanished overnight without leaving warmth behind. He noticed that the cabin didn't just lose heat, it never learned how to keep it. He had lived through winters before, he had built things meant to last. And he knew one uncomfortable truth most people avoided. If the same problem keeps happening, the design is wrong. This wasn't about suffering more bravely. It wasn't about splitting more wood or waking earlier. It was about the shape of the space itself, how it fought against heat instead of working with it. Square rooms trapped cold air, flat walls bled warmth. Corners acted like pockets where winter settled and refused to leave, and stone, the thing people feared most, wasn't the enemy. It was misunderstood. Most settlers believed stone was cold by nature. Touch it in winter and your hand recoiled. So they avoided it except for fireplaces. But what they didn't realize was that stone wasn't cold. It was honest. It matched its environment, and if you heated it properly, it didn't forget. Wood burned fast and forgot fast. Stone remembered. That idea wasn't popular, it wasn't safe, and it definitely wasn't traditional, which is why almost no one acted on it. Almost. Because, in a winter where families burned through their futures one log at a time, one man decided he wasn't going to accept the problem anymore. He wasn't going to fight the cold the same way everyone else did. And he wasn't going to build another cabin that lost the battle every night. Instead, he chose to change the shape of the fight itself, and that decision, made before the snow ever fell, would quietly turn one of the coldest winters anyone could remember into the moment everything people believed about staying warm began to collapse. He didn't arrive with a plan to change anything. At first, he just wanted what everyone else wanted. A roof that held, a fire that lasted, and children who didn't wake up crying from the cold. He had no interest in being different. Difference invited attention, and attention in small winter communities usually came with consequences. But winter has a way of stripping ideas down to their outcomes. His first season in that country taught him something no argument ever could. The cabin he moved into looked solid enough. Straight walls, fresh chinking, a stone hearth built by men who knew their craft. It should have worked. Everyone said it would. And yet, every night told the same story. Heat climbed, disappeared, and left the corners behind. No matter how much wood he fed the fire, the room never felt balanced. Warmth gathered where it wasn't useful, and abandoned the places where people slept. He watched it carefully. The fire burned hardest in one direction. The air moved in strange, broken loops, cold collected where walls met at right angles and stayed there, unmoved by flame or effort. By morning the floorboards were numb and the fire was ash. He could light it again, but he couldn't make the warmth stay. That bothered him. He had worked with stone long before he ever set foot in that valley. Not cabins, foundations. The kind meant to carry weight without shifting, meant to endure freeze and thaw without cracking apart. He knew how materials behaved when the temperature dropped. He knew which ones remembered heat and which ones didn't, and he knew geometry mattered more than people admitted. A square was easy to build, easy to measure, easy to teach, but it wasn't efficient. Corners disrupted movement. They created dead space. Areas where air slowed, settled, and cooled. In winter, that meant cold sank and stayed. Fires didn't heat evenly. They pushed warmth outward until it escaped, then demanded more fuel to repeat the cycle. A circle didn't do that. In a round space, heat moved continuously. There were no angles to interrupt it. Warm air rose, curved, and returned naturally. Cold had nowhere to collect. Every point on the wall sat the same distance from the fire. Every surface participated. It wasn't theory to him, it was observation. He had seen the same principles used in older stone structures back east, mills that stayed temperate through freezing nights, buildings that felt warm long after the fires inside had burned low. Not comfortable in a modern sense, but stable, balanced, predictable. That was what winter demanded. The idea formed slowly, not as a rebellion, but as a correction. He didn't think in terms of innovation. He thought in terms of failure, and square cabins in his mind were failing their purpose. When he mentioned it to others, the reaction was immediate. "You can't build round with stone," they said. "You need corners to lock things in. Stone is cold. Stone cracks. Stone will kill you in winter." The warnings came from men who had survived enough winters to believe experience was the same as understanding. They weren't stupid. They were comfortable. Comfortable with suffering they had learned to tolerate. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince anyone. He just stopped stacking logs and started gathering stone. River stone first. Dense pieces. Heavy ones. The kind that sank when dropped in water instead of floating with trapped air. He sorted them by size and shape, already imagining the curve they would form. He didn't rush. Rushing was for people racing winter instead of planning for it. When people asked what he was building, he answered honestly, "A cabin." When they asked why it was round, he answered simply, "Because heat doesn't like corners." That was enough to earn laughter. Some called it a waste of time. Others called it dangerous. A few said nothing at all, which in small communities meant they were already convinced it would fail. No one wanted to say it outright, but the thought hung heavy in the air. He was gambling with his family's winter. At night, alone, that thought returned to him too. Not doubt. Calculation. He measured again. Thought again. Checked what could go wrong. Stone could crack if the mortar failed. Draft could stall if the chimney was wrong. Snow load could collapse a flat roof. Each risk had an answer, but answers don't quiet fear the way tradition does. Still, he kept going, because he had seen what happened when you built the same thing everyone else built and hoped winter would be kind. Winter was never kind. It was consistent, and consistency could be planned for. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He wasn't trying to change the valley. He was trying to build one space where warmth stayed put instead of fleeing the moment you stopped feeding it. If he was wrong, the cold would expose it quickly. And if he was right, winter would do something far rarer. It would stop being the enemy. The foundation was where the disbelief turned into open criticism. People gathered to watch it take shape, boots crunching on frozen ground, hands tucked deep into coat pockets. They expected straight lines, measured corners, something familiar they could recognize as safe. What they saw instead was a perfect circle pressed into the earth, 12 feet across, marked not by timbers, but by stone. River stone and clay mortar. Nothing else. No frame, no corners, no compromise. The first stones went down slowly, each one chosen for weight and density, not appearance. He set them by hand, fitting curves the way other men fit angles. Every piece leaned inward slightly, the wall pulling itself together instead of pushing outward. It was masonry, not carpentry, but most people watching didn't care about the distinction. They saw risk. "That wall is too thick," someone said. "You're wasting material. It'll never hold snow. It'll crack when the freeze sets in." He didn't respond. He worked. The wall rose foot by foot, thicker at the base than the top, nearly 2 feet wide where it met the ground. Not because it needed to be, but because it had to be. Every inch added weight. Every stone added capacity. This wasn't a shell meant to block wind. It was a mass meant to store warmth. That idea made no sense to them. Stone was cold. Everyone knew that. You touched it in winter, and it burned your skin. You avoided it. You insulated from it. You certainly didn't surround your family with thousands of pounds of it and hope it kept you warm. They called it a tomb. They called it a root cellar with delusions of grandeur. They said he was building something meant to be buried. When the wall reached shoulder height, the jokes turned sharper. "How are you going to hang anything in there? Where do you put a bed? Where does the smoke go? What happens when the mortar freezes?" He answered only when a question mattered. The door would face south, away from the prevailing wind. The chimney would rise from the center, straight up through the roof. The roof would be conical, steep enough to shed snow, supported by beams radiating from a central hub. The mortar would flex slightly, not crack, because it wasn't cement. It was lime and sand, made to breathe. None of that eased their minds. Corners made people feel safe. Corners looked strong. Straight lines felt permanent. A circle felt unfinished, like something temporary, like something built by mistake. But Winter didn't care how things looked. As the wall climbed higher, the tone shifted from laughter to concern. Men who had mocked him earlier began lowering their voices. Women glanced at the structure and then at his children, bundled nearby, and looked away. This wasn't just about design anymore. It was about responsibility. Someone finally said it out loud. If this fails, you don't just freeze. You trap yourself in it. He stopped setting stone and stood up, not angry, not defensive, just tired of letting the idea go unanswered. He told them what he was building wasn't a cabin that fought the cold. It was one that absorbed heat and gave it back slowly. He said the walls weren't meant to be warm on the outside. They were meant to be warm where it mattered, inside, hours after the fire burned down. They didn't like that answer. It sounded like theory, and winter was no place for theory. The roof went on in late autumn. Pine beams cut rough, set like spokes from a central ring, rising into a cone. Cedar shakes overlapped thick enough to shed snow without catching it. At the peak, a small opening waited for the chimney, positioned so the draft would pull clean and steady. From a distance, the structure looked wrong, too low, too round, too heavy. It didn't dominate the land the way other cabins did. It settled into it. When the door was finally hung and the hearth finished, he lit the first fire. Not a roaring one. Just enough to dry the mortar and warm the stones slowly. The interior felt different immediately. Not hot, not cozy, even. Heat didn't rush past you. It stayed. His wife noticed before he did. "It's warm in here," she said quietly, not because the fire was strong, because the walls were already beginning to remember. Outside, the valley prepared for winter the same way it always had, stacking wood higher, sealing chinks tighter, bracing for nights that would steal warmth without asking. Inside the round stone cabin, something else was happening. The fire went out, and the cold didn't rush in to replace it. That was the moment the gamble stopped feeling like a gamble. But winter hadn't arrived yet, and when it did, it would decide whether this strange, stubborn circle was shelter or a very expensive mistake. He never used the word science for what he was doing. That word belonged to books, to schools, to people far away from winters that could kill you in your sleep. What he trusted wasn't theory written on paper. It was behavior. How materials reacted when the temperature dropped. How heat moved once it left the fire. How long warmth lingered when no one was feeding it. Most people thought they understood heat because they could feel it. Stand close to a fire, feel warm. Step away, feel cold. That was the limit of their thinking. But he had learned early on that heat was not just a feeling, it was a substance of sorts, something that could be stored, delayed, guided, or wasted, depending on how you built around it. In the square cabins everyone else lived in, the fire did one thing well and everything else poorly. It heated air fast, flames roared, air warmed, and for a few hours the room felt almost comfortable. But air is impatient. It rises, leaks, escapes. It rushes up chimneys, slides through gaps in chinking, and presses outward against thin walls that have no interest in holding on to it. By morning, the warmth is gone, not because the fire failed, but because the cabin never learned how to keep what it was given. Stone behaved differently. Stone was slow, heavy, reluctant to change. It didn't heat quickly, and that was exactly why people distrusted it. They touched cold stone and assumed it would always be cold. What they didn't understand was that stone, once warmed, didn't forget. It absorbed heat gradually and released it just as gradually, turning time itself into insulation. That was the heart of the idea. The fire in the center of the cabin wasn't meant to burn all night. It was meant to charge the walls. All day long, heat radiated outward from the hearth, soaking into thousands of pounds of stone. Not the surface alone, but deep into the mass. By evening, the walls weren't hot, but they were warm, evenly, quietly warm. The kind of warmth that didn't vanish when flames died down. At night, when the fire settled into coals, the process reversed. The air cooled first, as it always did, but the stone didn't. It began releasing the heat it had stored, feeding it back into the room slowly, steadily, without noise or flame. The cabin didn't rely on active fire to stay warm. It relied on memory. Shape made that possible. In a square room, heat behaved erratically. It shot toward flat walls, stalled in corners, and broke into uneven currents that left some places warm and others untouched. Corners weren't just awkward, they were thermal traps. Cold air sank there and stayed. Fires had to work harder to compensate, burning more wood to chase comfort that never fully arrived. In the round cabin, there were no places for heat to get lost. Warm air rose from the center and followed the curve of the walls naturally, circulating without interruption. There were no sharp angles to break the flow, no dead zones where cold could settle and wait. Every point along the wall was the same distance from the fire. Every surface participated equally. The room didn't fight itself. Even the roof played a role. The conical shape guided rising air toward the center, feeding the chimney's drawer without creating turbulence. Smoke rose clean. Fresh air entered low, gently, through the smallest gaps around the door, warming quickly as it met the stone. Ventilation happened without drafts. The cabin breathed without bleeding heat. None of this required equations or charts to understand. You could feel it working. The floor stayed warmer by morning. The walls were warm to the touch long after the fire had faded. Condensation formed on the inside of the door, a sign not of cold, but of warmth, meeting frozen air. The cabin held temperature the way a body holds warmth under a thick coat. The people who criticized the design had focused on the wrong question. They asked how much heat it would take to warm all that stone. He asked how much heat it would take to keep a family alive through the night. Once the stone was charged, the answer surprised even him. Less wood, not more, shorter fires, not longer ones, stability instead of constant effort. The cabin didn't demand attention every hour. It didn't punish sleep. It didn't wake you with frozen breath. It simply stayed warm. This wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was alignment, building a space that worked with the behavior of heat instead of against it. And as the first real cold night settled in, when frost crept along windows and the valley braced for weeks of below-zero air, the round stone cabin was already prepared. It didn't need to prove itself loudly. Winter would do that for it soon enough. The real test didn't arrive with ceremony. It came the way winter always did, quietly, decisively, without concern for opinions. The temperature dropped hard and stayed there. The kind of cold that didn't lift at noon, didn't soften with sun, didn't care how much wood you had stacked. Wind pressed down from the north, finding every weakness it could exploit. Snow moved sideways, packing itself into corners, seams and cracks like it had intent. Across the valley, fires burned hotter and longer. Men fed them through the night, eyes heavy, hands blistered, knowing that if the flames died completely, they might not get the cabin warm again before morning. Children slept fully clothed. Beds were dragged closer to hearths. Water buckets froze solid before dawn. This was the kind of night that decided things. Inside the round stone cabin, the fire had burned steadily through the day, not roaring, not starved, just enough to do its work. By evening, the stone walls were warm to the touch, not hot, not comforting in the way a flame is comforting, but steady, present. And then, deliberately, he let the fire die. Not all the way out, just down to coals. No feeding, no midnight tending, no banking it high to survive until morning. He wanted to know what would happen if the cabin had to rely on what it had already stored. The family went to bed without ceremony. No extra blankets, no anxious listening for the fire's breath, no early alarms. Outside, the wind rose. Snow piled against structures that resisted it, drifted around those that didn't. Somewhere nearby, a roof groaned under weight it wasn't built to carry. Somewhere else, a man woke his children to move them closer to the fire because the walls had gone cold again. Inside the round cabin, the temperature fell, slowly. An hour passed. Then another. The air cooled first, as expected, but the walls held. They released warmth gradually, evenly, the way they had been designed to do. The floor stayed tolerable. Breath didn't fog. No one woke, shivering. By morning, the difference was unmistakable. The fire was nearly ash, the coals faint, and yet the interior was still warm enough to move without stiffness, to breathe without pain, to wake without urgency. The water bucket hadn't frozen. Frost hadn't crept across the walls. The cabin hadn't surrendered its heat in the dark. He checked the thermometer. Nearly 30 degrees warmer than the cabins around them. Not warmer because the fire had burned longer. Not warmer because they had used more wood. Warmer because the warmth had nowhere to go. Outside, neighbors stepped into the cold dawn exhausted. Fires had been fed all night and still barely kept ahead of freezing air. Wood piles shrank faster than anyone had planned. Some men stood staring at their chimneys, smoke pouring out, wondering how so much heat could leave so little behind. Then someone noticed the stone cabin. Smoke rose from its chimney, thin, steady, unhurried, not the desperate plume of a fire fighting cold, but the quiet signal of warmth that didn't need to rush anywhere. A man walked over, then another. Hands pressed against the exterior stone and recoiled at the cold, exactly as expected. But inside, palms laid flat against the wall lingered. The stone radiated gently, evenly, like it was alive. No arguing followed. There was nothing left to argue with. The numbers spoke plainly. The cold had tested every structure the same way, and one had answered differently, not louder, not faster, just better. That night didn't make the round stone cabin famous. It made it undeniable. And once winter exposes a truth that clearly it doesn't stay hidden for long, the change didn't happen all at once. No one gathered to admit they were wrong. No apologies were made in public. Winter doesn't work that way, and neither do small communities. Pride fades quietly, one decision at a time. It started with visits. Not the kind where people announce themselves or ask questions loudly, just men stopping by on their way to town, standing a little too long near the door, letting their hands rest against the interior wall longer than necessary, listening to the silence inside the cabin, the absence of rushing fire, the lack of urgency. They noticed things they couldn't ignore. No ice on the water bucket, no frantic feeding of the fire. Children moving freely instead of huddling. They noticed how calm it felt. One of the valley's most outspoken critics came by on a bitter morning, boots heavy with snow, face drawn thin from weeks of interrupted sleep. He didn't say much. He stepped inside, looked around once, then looked again, slower this time. His eyes settled on the hearth. Just coals, no roaring flame, no piles of wood stacked for emergency. "How warm is it in here?" he asked. The answer landed heavier than any argument. That was the moment things shifted. Not because someone had been convinced, but because something had been felt. Warmth has a way of cutting through theory. You can debate ideas. You can't debate a wall that radiates heat when everything else has gone cold. Questions followed. How thick are the walls, really? How much wood do you burn in a day? What happens if the fire goes out completely? Does the stone ever crack? Answers were given without pride, without performance, just facts, less wood, steadier heat, no corners fighting the fire, stone that holds instead of leaks. By late winter, the laughter was gone. No one mocked the shape anymore. They just stared at it, measured it with their eyes, imagined it on their own land. Men who had once sworn they'd never live in a round structure now found themselves sketching circles in the dirt with their boots. By spring, the first foundation appeared. Not his, someone else's. Another circle, pressed into the thawing ground. Stone gathered carefully, mortar mixed slowly, a cabin built not because it looked right, but because winter had proven it worked. Then another, then another. The round stone cabin didn't replace tradition overnight. It didn't need to. It simply outperformed it. And in places where survival mattered more than pride, that was enough. Years later, people would talk about that winter the way people always talk about hard seasons. They'd mention the cold, the wood burned, the nights that never seemed to end. But they'd also mention the cabin, the strange one that didn't freeze, the one that stayed warm when everything else struggled. They wouldn't say the man was stubborn anymore. They'd say he was practical. And that was the highest compliment winter ever allowed. He never claimed to invent anything. He never wrote it down or tried to teach it formally. He built what worked, shared what he knew when asked, and let the results speak in the only language winter respects: warmth. The lesson wasn't about stone or circles alone. It was about questioning habits that survive only because they're familiar, about understanding that nature doesn't reward tradition, it rewards alignment. When you build in harmony with how heat moves, how cold settles, how materials behave, survival stops being a struggle and becomes a system. Long after that winter passed, long after other cabins rotted and were rebuilt, the round stone structures remained. Quiet, solid, unimpressed by time, they stood as proof of something simple and uncomfortable. Sometimes the safest place to stand is outside the square everyone else refuses to leave.